Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Introduction to Mind and Will. This week, we're going to conclude our unit on consciousness. All right, so today we are reading Chalmers once again, this time, The Hard Problem of Consciousness. Let's jump in. So, thus far, we've heard that there seems to be something about consciousness that physical explanations don't seem to capture. Right, we heard from Nagel that there's this subjective quality of our experience. There's something that it's like for me to have an experience that objective explanations can't seem to get. Why? Well, because by moving to the objective away from my subjective perspective, it seems like I'm losing the phenomena of my subjective perspective. I can't explain my subjective perspective from outside, right? So Nagel thinks it's sort of wrong-headed to think that we can offer a kind of objective explanation of this aspect, at least, of consciousness. We also saw Jackson and Chalmers last week offer us several thought experiments that try to get us to accept the intuition that they hold that consciousness cannot be a purely physical phenomena, right? We saw this from the knowledge argument and the conceivability argument. It seems like at least some thinkers within the philosophy of mind are pressing us in this direction where not only is consciousness not a purely physical phenomena, but perhaps it's not capturable in this kind of objective way of understanding things that we typically go for. Today, in Chalmers' Hard Problem of Consciousness, Chalmers is going to try to explain why those standard kinds of explanations really miss something about consciousness. Now, to be clear, Chalmers isn't here, at least, arguing that physicalism is wrong, right? Physicalism, remember, is the view that, the mind ultimately is the brain. But he is going to argue that physical explanations, like the kind of explanations we're used to giving when it comes to like physical phenomena, those kinds of things aren't going to work for consciousness. That's why, after all, it's a hard problem. So before we understand why the hard problem really is hard, it might be helpful to understand, Chalmers thinks so, easy problems. Right? There are more than one problem having to do with consciousness. Some of them easier than others. In fact, most of the problems within the philosophy of mind that have to do with consciousness are relatively easy. Okay, so the ones that are easy are the ones that Chalmers says can actually be solved, or at least approached, through some kind of purely physical or objective kind of investigation. So these problems have something to do with consciousness, but Chalmers is going to claim that they're not about consciousness simplicator. Okay, so these kind of problems have to do with things like this: the ability to discriminate, categorize, and react to environmental stimuli, the integration of information by a cognitive system, the reportability of mental states. That's being able to say something like, I'm thinking this, or I feel this. The ability of a system to access its own internal states, the focus of attention, the deliberate control of behavior, and finally, the difference between wakefulness and sleep. All of these things, Chalmers thinks, are in some way related to consciousness, but all of these things can be solved by our ordinary kinds of physical investigation. That, he thinks, makes them easy, or at least easier. Sometimes, he argues, we speak of these kinds of problems interchangeably with consciousness. But these kinds of phenomena, because they can be approached with our normal scientific methods, cannot be the same kind of thing as consciousness. In fact, Chalmers thinks that many philosophers of mind set up by saying, look, I can solve the problem of consciousness, and then they go on to solve one of these problems. Well, Chalmers thinks that's not really what we were asking you to solve. What we're curious about is the hard problem. Right. So first, why are these problems easy? And second, what is the hard problem then, if those aren't it? Well, it's the fact that in principle, those problems we saw earlier can be approached with this kind of normal scientific investigation. right? That doesn't mean that the problems are objectively easy. Right? Some of these problems, Chalmers thinks, and I think there's reason to think that he's being optimistic here. Some of these problems he thinks are going to take centuries more to solve. Right? So it's not the case that we're anywhere near solving any of these problems. We might not even be close to figuring out how to answer some of these questions. But they can, in principle, be investigated in the same way. That's why they're thought of as being relatively easy. They're easy, at least compared to the hard problem. So the hard problem then cannot be approached in our normal scientific method of investigation. What is it? Well, the hard problem just is experience. It's just experience. Specifically, the hard problem is how conscious individuals experience at all. Quote, why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience? The quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle C. How can we explain why there is something it's like to entertain a mental image or to experience an emotion? In other words, it seems like this kind of experience, the feeling of having the experience, isn't necessary for the functions to perform, the functions of the mind to perform. So why do we have experience? Why? For what purpose? And where is it coming from? How do we explain it? That's the hard problem of consciousness. Okay. So, why do philosophers and scientists alike keep claiming that we can solve the problem, as we've seen a few times now, of consciousness if it's actually this hard? Well, again, Chalmers thinks it has to do with this kind of confusion between the easy problems and the hard problem. It's easy to mistake those easy problems as being about consciousness, but they're just, in fact, around consciousness, right? So most of the works that claim to be solving the problem of consciousness, Chalmers thinks, are really just approaching some easy problem. Think back to the Aikens piece, right? What it's like to be boring and myopic, right? She goes into great detail about what bat perception must be like. Chalmers is likely going to say something like, that kind of attempt gets us something interesting, but those are all easy problems. She's not going to be able to approach the hard problem the same way. In other words, she's not going to be able to explain, using scientific investigation, why it is that the bat would have experience at all. Why is there a quality to the experience of the bat at all if it's not necessary? Now, to Aiken's credit, she more or less says within her article that she's suspicious that they would have anything like experience. Maybe she doesn't think that holds for humans, but there are some philosophers of mind who do, right? Who are going to argue something like, yeah, this experience thing that you're looking for is not a robust phenomena. It's not a genuine thing that's in need of explanation. It's just like a myth of philosophers. Setting that aside for now, why is experience so different, right? What about it makes it difficult to explain in the same way that, well, these easy problems are easy to tackle? Well, Chalmers says that most of these problems around consciousness, having to do with the phenomena targeted by the easy problems, most of them are in need of functional explanation. That is, they're in need of us being able to account for how they work, right? How they work. Once we figure out how they work, the problem has been solved. Problem's been solved. Sometimes when we want to give one of these kind of functional explanations, we also want to appeal to the mechanisms that are responsible for performing them. So, for example, it might be that behind memory, there's a certain kind of function, right? Memory works this way for this reason. And underneath that is a neural mechanism, maybe something like long-term potentiation, right? But once we've explained that, this is the function of memory, and this is how it's expressed in a brain through long-term potentiation, that's the end of the story. That's it. We have fully explained the phenomena. That kind of thing isn't going to work for experience. Quote, Throughout the higher level sciences, reductive explanation works in just this way. To explain the gene, for instance, we needed to specify the mechanism that stores and transmits hereditary information from one generation to the other. It turns out that DNA performs this function. Once we explain how the function is performed, we've explained the gene. So there's nothing more to the gene than giving it this functional explanation. Not so for experience, because experience seems to be something in addition to the function. It seems like we can have all of the function and not require experience. Experience seems to be something extra, right? It seems like your visual cortex, your eyes, the whole visual system within your brain and on your skull, right, could operate perfectly well without you having any kind of visual experience. It seems like that's conceivable, at least. So why do we have visual experience then? Why is there a something that it's like to see a red apple? It doesn't seem like we can account for that with a purely functional sort of explanation. This, of course, is hearkening back to Chalmers' zombie argument, right? It seems like I can imagine or I can conceive of a being that's entirely like me in all physical regard, but doesn't have to have consciousness. So why do we have consciousness? In other words, quote, why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner feel? That's the hard problem, explaining why that's not the case. Okay, so Chalmers now runs through 5 or so strategies that researchers who want to appeal to those old scientific kinds of explanations that they might use in order to deal with or account for experience in some way. So let's run through those. First is to explain something other than experience. Is to say, look, the experiential part of consciousness is too difficult. Not necessarily denying the importance of it, but it's intractable, right? We can't really make any progress on it here and now. So it's to some degree to agree with Chalmers, right? For that reason, Chalmers thinks it's not so bad, right? It's just not very ambitious, since the research is really just going to be about one of those easy problems. The second is to deny experience. This I sort of gestured towards earlier. The idea here is that once you give that full functional story of the mind, the brain, there's nothing left, right? So this idea of there being something missing, like experience, that's just false. Once we have fully understood how the brain works, we've understood how the mind works. That's it. There is nothing like qualia or a qualitative aspect of experience. Chalmers doesn't like this. He finds it unsatisfying because he thinks that it's a central portion, a central thing about our lived mental lives. He thinks that we cannot help but feel this sort of way of experiencing, that there is something that it's like to experience this or that. And because that's so central to our mental life, Chalmers thinks it would be a mistake to try and deny this kind of thing, right? Whether or not that's a fair critique is an interesting question. There are many philosophers of mind who don't think, along with Chalmers, that it is so integral, right? Some explain, or attempt to explain, that we might think it's very integral to our lives, but there's really nothing there. There's really nothing there. Okay, moving on. Third, some researchers argue that their functional accounts do explain experience. So this time around, the researcher is suggesting that, look, experience is an important part of consciousness, but I think I can give an account for it, right? I think I can give some kind of account for it through a purely functional explanation. Chalmers thinks that all of these have failed thus far, right? He thinks that thus far, they always have to make some kind of move that very quickly glosses over how their functional explanation is supposed to account for phenomenal experience. It's almost like, Chalmers says, the experience kind of emerges as if by magic, right? They have a pretty robust account of the function, and then suddenly there's experience, right? Obviously, Chalmers doesn't think that that's satisfactory. What Chalmers doesn't do here is give grounds for thinking that this can never be done, right? He doesn't give grounds for thinking here, at least, that this can never be done. Okay. Fourth, researchers might try to explain some of the structural aspects of our experience. That is, they might try to show that because our brains are structured in certain ways, we can understand why our experience is to some degree how it is. So here's how that works. Acknowledge that there is something that it's like to have an experience. There's a redness that I experience when I see the apple, right? Well, in looking at the brain and all of the other things that contribute functionally to my experience, like my eyes, my retinas, etc., perhaps I can start to paint a picture of what experience must be like. This is sort of what Aiken's project was in What Is It Like to Be Boring and Myopic, right? Chalmers thinks that that's important kind of work, but it's not going to tell us ultimately why there is experience. So while it's still important, at the same time, it's not addressing the hard problem. Okay, last strategy. It might be that researchers try to isolate the physical aspects that lead to conscious experience. In other words, they might try to identify what we call in philosophy the neural correlates of consciousness. A neural correlate of consciousness is something that has to occur in the brain or that always occurs in the brain whenever you're having some kind of conscious experience, right? So the idea here would be that, look, I can show you when you're having a conscious experience. Chalmers thinks that, once again, the strategy is incomplete. Sure, that's very cool. It's very important that you can show us when consciousness happens by showing us the neural correlates. But you still haven't explained why and how there is experience. So once again, the hard problem goes unaddressed. So it's clear then, Chalmers thinks, something is missing. There is some missing ingredient. Okay, so what is this missing ingredient? Well, Chalmers says that people in philosophy of mind have started appealing to a number of things. Things like chaos and nonlinear dynamics, non-algorithmic processing, and, more recently, quantum mechanics. There's a reason why these sorts of things are being pointed to as the potential missing ingredient. Mostly, Chalmers thinks it has to do with the fact that, well, they're relatively new. And thus, if our old way of explaining things is not capturing conscious experience, maybe we ought to look at the new for a way of doing it, right? But ultimately, he argues, they're still going to end up failing. Why? Because all of these potentials for the missing ingredient are still like purely physical explanations, right? They're still relying on nothing but a physical kind of explanation. Quote, for any physical process we specify, there will be an unanswered question. Why should this process give rise to experience? Given any such process, it is conceptually coherent that it could be instantiated in the absence of experience. Once again, it's that old conceivability argument, right? It's the zombie argument all over again. If what you're giving me in order to explain consciousness is a physical story, I will always be able to say I could have that same physical story without conscious experience. And therefore, it seems like the two must be different, right? You cannot explain by giving a purely physical explanation why I have experience. You can't explain that, right? So the hard problem then isn't telling us that the mind is in some way not physical. That is not what is being communicated with the hard problem here. Maybe some who use the hard problem want to use it as a means for arguing for substance dualism or something like it, but that's not what Chalmers is doing, at least here. Chalmers is arguing that it just cannot be given a physical kind of explanation. So as Chalmers notes himself, quote, Experience may arise from the physical, but it is not entailed by the physical. There's something more about consciousness, by Chalmers' view, that can't be captured by the physical. That doesn't mean necessarily that it's not a physical phenomena or that it at least emerges out of physical phenomena. So, what should we do then? Well, if Chalmers is right, then we should take consciousness to be this kind of irreducible phenomena. To be irreducible means you cannot explain it by using other terms, right? So I can't explain it, for example, by just using language about the brain, right? It seems to be its own thing, not capable of being explained away. It might be that the mind is ultimately physical, but our theories of mind can't ignore conscious experience. We can't just say, yeah, push that aside. If I can explain the brain, I've done enough. Um, and it becomes clear, at least if we take Chalmers at face value, that we're not going to be able to give those kinds of explanations using purely physical explanations. We're going to need something more psychologically robust. However, that doesn't mean Chalmers is the only one working here, right? You have an optional reading assigned this week. It comes out of Patricia Churchland's book, Neurophilosophy. She disagrees with Chalmers. Patricia Churchland is a neurophilosopher, if you couldn't tell by the title of the book, right? She wants to argue at the end of the day that conscious experience is not irreducible. In fact, if conscious experience is anything at all, it must be reducible to talk about the brain, right? In her view, if your theory requires you to posit something that you don't have any way of explaining, then that's not the kind of thing you should be positing in the first place, right? So think of it this way. If what you're saying is, look, I have this phenomena, this conscious experience, but I can't explain it, then perhaps you should reevaluate whether or not the phenomena is real at all, right? So Churchland, like some other philosophers of mind, is ultimately going to be arguing, look, you need to either get rid of this idea of phenomenal experience, since you yourself say that it cannot be explained, or you need to accept that in principle, it's capturable in the same way that everything else is. Okay, whatever your feelings on the matter, that is going to conclude our very brief introduction to the problem of consciousness. Consciousness, you could have a full class on, but it becomes a bit sophisticated, right? So for our purposes, as an intro to mind and will class, this is a good point at which to leave it behind. Next week, we're going to start something altogether new. We're going to start talking about artificial intelligence. So, can we ever create a mind? Could they ever be conscious? We'll talk more on that next week. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe.